Have you ever heard the phrase going all in? It's describing that moment where you put everything you have behind a particular decision or course of action. It originates from the game of poker. Players bet money based on either how certain they are that they can win each round with the cards they have been dealt, or how certain they are that they can bluff a win. That is, make everyone else think they have a winning hand when they don't. Towards the end of the game, players can choose to go all in. This is where they bet all the money that they have won so far, every last penny, on the certainty of winning that last hand, and so winning the game. If you win, then you win big. But if you lose everything. When you're playing poker with your friends just for fun, this isn't a problem. In these kind of games, you may only be playing for a few pounds, maybe a handful of dollars. That's even if you're playing for money at all. But imagine playing a high-stakes game where you are literally putting hundreds of thousands of pounds into the pot, or maybe even millions of dollars. Deciding whether or not to go all in a game like that would be a really big decision indeed. Towards the end of his life, Jacob, the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, he came to a point where he had to decide whether to go all in or not. He had to decide whether he would put his life on the line in order to fix his broken relationship with his brother Esau. But more than that, Jacob also reached the point of going all in his relationship with the Lord. This was the point where he would decide just how committed he was to God and just what he was prepared to put on the line to receive all that God had promised. If Jacob went all in and it paid off, he would win big. But if Jacob went all in and failed, he would literally lose everything, even his life. God gave Abraham an amazing promise. He promised a place to live, a people who would become a great nation, and a blessing both for Abraham, but also for all peoples of the earth through him. This promise and blessing passed from Abraham to his son Isaac, and then from Isaac to his son Jacob. So far in Jacob's life, he had managed to outwit pretty much everyone, his older brother and his father especially, so that he would be sure to receive God's promised blessing. Esau had threatened to kill Jacob, and so Jacob had run away. For 20 years, he had lived with a family member 500 miles away. And during that time, he had married, had lots of children, and had become very successful in business. But the problem was, the place where Jacob had been living was not the place that God had said he would bless Jacob and his family. That was back where he'd come from in the Promised Land. And so finally, God told Jacob it was time to head home. The only problem was that he would have to finally confront his brother Esau. We're going to join Jacob about to cross a river. He's reached the edge of his homeland on his way back to the land that God had promised him and his family. Jacob had already sent messengers ahead of him to let his brother know that he was coming. The messengers returned and explained to Jacob that Esau was going to come and meet him along with 400 men. It's no surprise that Jacob was filled with great fear and was very distressed. It seemed as though Esau was coming to carry out his threat to kill Jacob. What did Jacob do? He prayed. This is what he said.
O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted.
Jacob was someone who relied on his cunning and ingenuity. As a young man, he had cheated, tricked, and wiggled his way through life. For example, he had outwitted and outmaneuvered a relative named Laban, the one he was living with, who himself had tried to cheat Jacob out of payment for Jacob's hard work. Yet here, as an old man preparing to face the consequences of his actions, Jacob didn't rely on his own intelligence or craftiness to save him anymore. Instead, he began by simply praying. He prayed that God would save him and somehow prevent Esau from killing him. And he could only pray this prayer because he had remembered what God had promised. That God declared Jacob's descendants would be as numerous as the grains of sand of the sea. Jacob believed God. Jacob believed that God would keep his word, and so Jacob held on to God's promise. Once Jacob had finished praying, Jacob prepared himself for the meeting with his older brother. He arranged for a long line of gifts to go ahead of him, each one designed to appease Esau and hopefully pacify his anger. Jacob also made sure that his family and all of their belongings were safe on the other side of a small river. And then he waited, ready to face Esau alone. Eventually, during the night, someone did come along, but it wasn't Esau.
That night, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please, tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared."
This is one of the more curious and puzzling moments in the Old Testament. There's lots about this incident that we just simply do not know or might find hard to understand. But while we might not be able to know everything we would want to know, we can be sure that we have everything we need to know. And the key point in this encounter is the moment that the stranger touched Jacob's hip, immediately dislocating it. That seems to be the moment that Jacob realized that this was not just a mere man before him. Sure enough, in this brief conversation that followed, Jacob discovers that the stranger he has been grappling with and still had hold of was none other than God himself. Now, if you find it hard to get our heads around this event, imagine how Jacob must have been feeling. Jacob knew that he needed to confront his brother, Jacob knew that he needed to get home. Why? Because Jacob knew that God had promised to bless him there, in that land, and nowhere else. Jacob believed God. Jacob believed God would keep his word, and so he held on to God's promise. We've already seen that. And now, even though God himself was standing in the way, Jacob was determined to receive the blessing that God had promised. First to his grandfather Abraham, then to his father Isaac, and now to him. And so, despite being exhausted, despite being in great pain, despite literally wrestling with God, Jacob held on and wouldn't let go until God kept his promise. The moment he realized that he was wrestling with God, Jacob knew that he faced a big decision in his relationship with the Lord. There, locked arm in arm with God, the time to go all in was now or never. Either he would get God to keep his promise and bless him, or he would most likely die trying. In the heat of the moment, broken, beaten, with nothing making sense to him, Jacob knew all he could do was hold on to God's promise of blessing. And that meant literally not letting go of God, holding on to him until he had kept his promise. I wonder, how important to you is your relationship with the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? How important to you is God's promise of blessing? God has kept his promise for a blessing that is for all people through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Through our faith in him, God has promised to bless us with forgiveness for sin and eternal life with him in a perfect new creation. So, when people make fun of you for taking an interest in Jesus, are you prepared to endure that struggle to keep hold of God's promises? When people make life difficult for you for being a Christian, are you ready to resist the urge to give in to the pressure that you face for the sake of the blessing of knowing God and following Jesus? Or what if life becomes or is really hard for you? Nothing makes sense, and it seems that even God himself is somehow set against you. Even then, will you hold on and wait patiently for God to keep his promises as he said he would? Jacob was ready to struggle both with man and with God. He was prepared to face the consequences of his actions concerning his brother, and he was even willing to wrestle against God himself to make sure he received the blessing that God had promised. What will you do to keep hold of God's promises? What will you do to receive the blessing that we have been given through faith in Jesus Christ? In this series, we've been looking at the promise God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise that has been the foundation of God's people throughout history. The promise was given to Abraham, who received it by faith and so was counted as righteous. Even when Abraham and Isaac's faith was put to the test, not even death could overcome that promise. We discover that though Isaac was obedient to his father and ready to die, he was ultimately saved by the substitute that God himself provided. As for Jacob, he lived out a life of growing faith in God. It started with seeing the true value of God's blessing. It became real and personal to him in the dream of the heavenly staircase, and it finally resulted in him going all in to make sure that he received the blessing promised by the Lord. God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was a promise to bless them with a place to live and a growing family. And God kept that promise. God's promise to their descendants, the people of Israel, was in part a promise to bless them and make them into a great nation with a land of their own. and God has kept that promise too. But ultimately, God's promises are for all people. God promised to bless people from all the nations of the earth with a forever home and a forever blessing. And God has kept that promise. He kept it through his Son, Jesus Christ. So, by faith, build your life upon the strong foundation of the Lord, the God who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of you and me, and look forward to receiving his promises and his blessings. Hold on as if your life depends on him, because actually it does.